Keith, it looks like climate action certificate. It's actually Rhode Island, written only. Peg's
Can
here?
I speak briefly?
Oh, it says 11.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Peg.
That's
And we can have Mark Tremley from Rhode Island, what's that say? FCO? I'm sorry, Peg.
No problem. Yes.
Go ahead, Judy, thank you. Peg, you're up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, my name is Peg Sweeney. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm pleased to be here. I'm only going to take a few minutes. The Farm Bureau has submitted a letter in support of this bill. No one could be here from the Farm Bureau tonight. I'm not going to testify substantively, but they did want to share with the committee that they do support the bill in concept, but they're looking forward to working with the sponsor and the committee members and to be part of the discussion moving forward and serve as a resource as well. No one could be here, but that would be the testimony for tonight. Generally supportive of the concept.
Thank you very much. And we look forward to working with the sponsor Andy. Sheila.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Sheila Dormody with the Nature Conservancy here in Rhode Island. We are also a substantial property owner and manager in the state, managing about 10,000 acres of forest here in Rhode Island. We strongly support the concept of this legislation to preserve the integrity and viability of the state's woodlands. In my written testimony, I gave you a picture to look at to see how special and unique our borderlands forests are here in Rhode Island. This is a picture from NASA, the lights at night. So looking at the corridor from Boston to Washington, D.C., it really stands out. This beautiful coastal forest is really unique throughout our region and worthy of that preservation that we are talking about here today. It's an area that the Nature Conservancy and the state have looked at as a priority area for decades, but we have not had the structures in place from a legal perspective to provide all of the support that we could possibly need. Private entities have been doing remarkable work, but we have been seeing increasing threats of fragmentation as well as degradation of the forest throughout this area. The importance of that corridor that we have there is the issue of connectivity. To be able to maintain the intact forests is the way that animals are able to adapt to either immediate threats of a natural disaster or encroaching human development or seasonal changes. Maybe it's a hot year or a wet year. Animals need room to move around. And that becomes even more important as our climate changes. We already know that our species are migrating to higher altitudes and higher latitudes in order to get to the climate that they need to thrive. And having a connected forest is the only way they're going to be able to do that, to be able to survive. And of course, these are the lungs for our state. They are also important for our own health and mental health as well. So we know we have seen some threats. This bill was built out of some of the work that we have been doing on renewable energy siting that has been referenced here today. One of the principles that we talked about in that hearing was that we need to treat all types of development equally. All of the threats to forest fragmentation need to be considered in whole. It's not just about renewable energy siting, but it's about anything that's being built in these forested areas. And this sets up a process where we'll be able to develop appropriate strategies to address all of those threats systematically. Partly because we've already been deep into this conversation, we already have a couple of working groups that are going to be able to support DEM with the capacity they're going to need to address these issues, both through the Woodland Partnership and through the Forest Conservation Advisory Group. The part of the bill that I think addresses private property owners is when it lists out all of the people who need to be part of the decision making. It on page 4, line 5, it refers to persons with scientific, professional, and personal knowledge of woodland science and issues. But that might be an area of the bill that is worth further clarification through an amendment process as we get more specific about how we want to be moving forward with these processes. We thank you for your consideration of these issues. By moving forward with this strategy, we will be able to protect our critical natural resources, avoid future siting conflicts, and support smart economic development throughout our state.
Thank you, Sheila. Mark Trimley.
Yes, good afternoon. Mark Tremblay, I'm a forester. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Rhode Island Forest Conservators Organization, which is, or RIFCO for short, which is the private non-profit Forest Landowners Association. We represent the thousands of forest landowners that own much of this land that most people are referring to. And we have some of the wood operators, also known as loggers, other foresters that are members of the organization. And our mission is for the protection and wise use of Rhode Island's forest land. So in concept, there are many concepts that have been discussed here today that are spot on. And there's a real need to recognize across the state the value of the forest and the forest ecosystem, just like everybody's been saying. Unfortunately, this legislation we cannot support because it's duplicating other efforts that are going on in the state, and it provides these mandates to both the states and the towns that trample on private property rights. So there are segments of this legislation that we could support in the long run, but what we're recommending, and I've provided some written letter here, is that we take a step back, put this on hold, and let the Forest Conservation Advisory Committee, which has been meeting for the past several months, will be developing a report later this year that will spell out a range of options for us to incorporate. The Rhode Island Woodland Partnership, many of the members of the partnership are involved in this advisory committee. The Rhode Island DEM is deeply involved in that advisory committee. And so before we put any unfunded mandates on the state, on towns, let's just take a step back and let's let that advisory committee do its job. If another advisory committee or council that's in this legislation is deemed necessary, maybe move forward with that next year. Thank you.
Yes, Representative Ryan Bassett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for you, sir.
Yes.
Are you suggesting whether there may be some government overreach? And are you concerned about the previous speaker's testimony in relation to, I'm just going to read from what she suggested there, the degree to which animals can move freely across the landscape. Such movement is critical in maintaining genetic diversity. Additionally, I'm kind of skipping around here. Additionally, wildlife may need to escape natural disaster and or adapt to seasonal changes in the availability of food. And she mentioned a couple other things, and I don't want to go back and reread your testimony, regurgitate testimony, but how do you feel about that?
Well, like I say, all these comments that are made by the folks from the Audubon Society and Nature Conservancy, they're all scientifically valid positions or situations that we all need to protect with an intact forest canopy. I'm not arguing against that. I'm just saying that there are better ways of going about establishing the protections of the intact forest without there are segments of this legislation that just go way too far. And there is already an effort by this Forest Conservation Advisory Committee. They're working already on this effort to identify the options that may be available that are in use in other parts of the country that could be applied here, in addition to the existing programs that we have. Somebody mentioned the Farm Forest Open Space Program. That's a huge program that we have that not enough people take advantage of it. And forest land and farmland, trees and cows don't go to school, so in speaking to property taxes, it's important to protect that land base so that the property taxes don't go sky high because every town has to build a new school or a new police station or a new fire station as the community develops.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes.
I'm curious about the advisory committee. Under what auspices was it created? Or where did it come from?
Well, that developed as a small grant that the Rhode Island Tree Council, which is a urban forestry type of group of the cities and towns, arborists, and concerned about the urban forest community. That group got a $15,000 grant from the Rhode Island DEM to establish this committee, and it's got representation across the board, from across the state. Looking at the different options, we've hired a consultant to help us pull together research from other states, and it's going to report back to the director of DEM later this summer.
Any idea as to when that report will be issued?
It's due back to her by August.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Our next two witnesses will be Topher Hamlet and Sarah O'Brien. Topher Hamlet from Save the Bay. And Sarah, to this.
I'm not testifying on this bill, I'm testifying on the other bill.
You signed up for 5813.
I put no testimony next to it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm here on behalf of Save the Bay, and our mission is to protect and improve Narragansett Bay. And I will include in that Little Narragansett Bay, which is on the Connecticut-Rhode Island border, and the lower end of the Wood-Pawcatuck watershed region. We're here in support of this legislation. We understand that there are a lot of issues that have been raised, and I know this is a work in progress, but it is very important that Narragansett Bay, Little Narragansett Bay watersheds are protected. The bays themselves, people think of them as sort of standalone entities, but you know, the Narragansett Bay watershed reaches up to Worcester, Massachusetts, and Brockton, Massachusetts. And we agree with the premise of the bill, which is that Rhode Island needs a strategy or set of strategies to protect our woodlands and to stop and limit and halt forest fragmentation as much as possible. This is important for protecting drinking water, wildlife, and habitat, and Narragansett Bay and Little Narragansett Bay. I do want to recognize the work of the Forest Conservation Advisory Committee, whose work should absolutely be incorporated into these strategies moving forward. I also want to echo Representative McEntee's concern. She raised over resources. For over a decade, the resources of the Department of Environmental Management have been whittled away to the point where it's difficult for the department just to do the fundamental work that it needs to do. So anytime you consider legislation like this, please think of the resources that are needed to actually implement. It's time to sort of reverse the trend of cutting back resources and actually putting resources back into these core functions. So this is about ecology, quality of life, and yes, economy, but the protection of our woodlands and most importantly, the strategy that we need to protect the woodlands is essential to Narragansett Bay and Little Narragansett Bay. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Hamlet?